The store manager wanted him to focus on stocking efficiency instead of wasting time watching security monitors and questioning suspicious customers. But when three armed men entered Murphy's Market at 2 a.m., Frank's inefficient surveillance habits became the only thing standing between his coworkers and a tragedy that would have made headlines. Welcome to Retired Soldier Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden vigilance and protective instincts, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe that some people never stop being guardians, even when their badge becomes a name tag, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who continue to serve and protect in the most ordinary places. Frank Patterson clocked in for his night shift at Murphy's Market at exactly 10:00 p.m., just as he had every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday for the past 3 years. At 67, Frank was the oldest member of the overnight crew, responsible for stocking shelves, receiving deliveries, and maintaining the store during the quiet hours when most of the community was asleep. Murphy's Market was a mid-sized grocery store in the suburban town of Millbrook, serving a customer base that was generally affluent and safety-conscious. The overnight shift was typically uneventful, restocking products that had sold during the day, preparing for the morning rush, and occasionally helping the few customers who needed groceries during late-night hours. Frank's co-workers found him to be reliable but frustratingly inefficient. While younger employees could stock an entire aisle in the time it took Frank to handle half a section, Frank seemed more interested in observing the store's surroundings than focusing on his assigned tasks. He would spend what management considered excessive time checking security monitors, watching the parking lot through windows, and engaging customers in conversations that seemed unnecessarily lengthy. Frank, you need to understand that our priority is getting product on the shelves, store manager Dale Morrison had told him during his most recent performance review. Corporate tracks our overnight productivity, and we can't afford to have team members spending time on activities that aren't directly related to stocking. Frank had nodded politely, as he always did when receiving feedback about his work habits. I understand, Mr. Morrison. I'll work on being more efficient. But Frank hadn't changed his routine because he knew something that Dale Morrison didn't. He wasn't just a night shift grocery worker with slow stocking habits. He was Detective Frank Patterson, retired after 25 years with the Millbrook Police Department, with more experience recognizing and preventing crimes than anyone else in the building. Frank's transition from law enforcement to retail work had been driven by financial necessity rather than choice. His police pension provided basic living expenses, but medical bills from his wife's cancer treatment had created debt that required supplemental income. The overnight grocery position offered flexible hours and steady pay, allowing Frank to contribute to their household while avoiding the stress and responsibility of his previous career. What Frank hadn't anticipated was how difficult it would be to suppress 25 years of police instincts while working in a civilian environment. His habit of scanning for potential threats, memorizing faces, and maintaining situational awareness were viewed as distractions rather than valuable security measures. His tendency to engage suspicious customers in conversation was seen as poor customer service rather than crime prevention. But Frank couldn't turn off his training, and he wouldn't ignore his instincts when they warned him that something wasn't right. If that made him the least efficient stalker on the overnight crew, so be it. Murphy's Market operated with minimal overnight security, just a basic alarm system, a few aging security cameras, and the assumption that a suburban grocery store wasn't an attractive target for serious criminals. The store stayed open until midnight, then locked its doors while the overnight crew worked inside, reopening at 6:00 a.m. for early shoppers. Frank had identified multiple security vulnerabilities during his 3 years at the store, but his attempts to discuss these concerns with management had been politely dismissed. Dale Morrison appreciated Frank's dedication, but he didn't see the need for enhanced security measures in a community where the most serious crime was usually shoplifting or vandalism. What Dale didn't understand was that Frank's police experience had taught him that criminals often targeted businesses that appeared secure but actually had exploitable weaknesses. Grocery stores were particularly attractive because they handled large amounts of cash, operated with minimal late-night staffing, and were located in areas where police response times were predictable. Frank had been conducting his own informal security assessment of Murphy's Market since his first day on the job. He'd noted the positioning of security cameras, identified blind spots in surveillance coverage, and observed patterns in customer behavior that might indicate criminal reconnaissance. Most importantly, he developed what he called protective awareness, a systematic approach to monitoring the store's environment for potential threats. This level of vigilance was invisible to his co-workers, who saw only an older man who moved slowly and seemed easily distracted from his assigned duties. They didn't realize that Frank's inefficient stocking habits were actually security patrols disguised as routine work, or that his unnecessary conversations with customers were actually threat assessments conducted while maintaining the appearance of friendly service. The threat had been building for several weeks, though Frank was the only person who had recognized it. In late October, he'd begun noticing a pattern of suspicious activity around the store during his shifts. Cars parked in the lot for extended periods without occupants making purchases. Individuals walking through the store during late hours who seemed more interested in observing employee routines than shopping for groceries. Phone conversations conducted in the parking lot that appeared to involve surveillance of the building. Frank had documented these observations and reported them to Dale Morrison, but his concerns were dismissed as the overactive imagination of a former cop who was having trouble adjusting to civilian work. Dale appreciated Frank's vigilance but didn't see any evidence of credible criminal activity. "Frank, I understand that your police background makes you more aware of security issues," Dale had said during their conversation about Frank's reports. "But we need to balance security concerns with maintaining a welcoming environment for our customers. If we start treating every late-night shopper like a potential criminal, we'll drive away the business we're trying to protect." Frank had understood Dale's position, but he'd also understood something that Dale didn't. Criminals were skilled at appearing normal while conducting surveillance and planning attacks. The suspicious activity Frank had observed might seem innocuous to civilian eyes, but it followed patterns that he'd seen dozens of times during his police career. So Frank had continued his informal security monitoring, accepting criticism about his work efficiency while quietly preparing for a threat that he hoped would never materialize but knew was increasingly likely. The attack came on a Tuesday night in early November. At exactly 2:17 a.m., Frank was in aisle 7, stocking canned goods and monitoring the security feed on a small tablet that employees used for inventory management. The store had been closed to the public for over 2 hours, and the overnight crew of 4 was spread throughout the building, working on their assigned sections. That's when Frank noticed movement in the parking lot that made his trained instincts immediately alert. 3 men had emerged from a dark sedan and were approaching the store's rear entrance, the employee access door that was supposed to be secured, but that Frank knew had a faulty lock that management had been postponing repair for weeks. The men moved with the kind of purposeful coordination that Frank recognized from 25 years of investigating crime. They weren't employees, they weren't delivery personnel, and they weren't conducting any legitimate business at a closed grocery store at 2:17 a.m. They were criminals preparing to commit a robbery, and Frank was the only person in the building who understood what was about to happen. Frank faced a decision that he'd hoped never to encounter in his civilian job: how to respond to an imminent threat when he no longer had police authority, backup, or weapons. He could call 911 and hope that police arrived before the situation escalated into violence, or he could use his training to protect his co-workers by taking direct action. Frank chose to protect his co-workers, moving with speed and precision that would have surprised anyone familiar with his usual slow stocking pace. Frank began implementing emergency protocols that he'd developed during his police career, but had adapted for a civilian environment. His first priority was to alert the other members of the overnight crew without causing panic or triggering actions that might escalate the situation. Frank used the store's intercom system to broadcast a code phrase that he'd taught his co-workers during safety meetings. "Attention team members, we have a delivery verification issue in progress. Please gather in the break room for immediate consultation." To civilians, this sounded like a routine operational message. To Frank's co-workers, who had been trained on basic security protocols, it was a signal to move away from the sales floor and gather in the most secure location in the building. Frank's second priority was to observe the intruders and gather intelligence that could be used by responding police officers. Using his knowledge of the store's layout and security camera positions, Frank positioned himself to monitor the criminals' entry and assess their weapons, capabilities, and intentions. What Frank saw confirmed his worst fears. The three men were armed with handguns and had equipped themselves with the kind of tactical gear that suggested they were prepared for extended confrontation. They weren't opportunistic thieves looking for easy money. They were organized criminals who had planned this operation and were prepared to use violence to achieve their objectives. The men entered through the rear door exactly as Frank had predicted, moving immediately toward the store's office where they apparently expected to find a safe or cash deposits from the previous day's sales. Their knowledge of the store's layout suggested they had conducted reconnaissance, probably during some of the suspicious visits that Frank had reported to management. Frank's police training told him that this was a professional robbery crew that had probably targeted multiple businesses and was skilled at intimidating employees and extracting maximum cash while minimizing their time on scene. They would be efficient, ruthless, and willing to hurt anyone who interfered with their operation. Frank activated the store's silent alarm and called 911, providing dispatch with a detailed description of the situation and the intruders. But he knew that police response time would be at least 5 minutes, and a lot of violence could occur in 5 minutes if the situation wasn't managed properly. That's when Frank made a decision that transformed him from civilian grocery worker back into Detective Frank Patterson. Using skills honed during 25 years of police work, Frank began conducting what he called protective disruption, actions designed to confuse and delay the criminals while protecting potential victims. He turned off lights in sections of the store, creating darkness that would hinder the intruders' movement while providing concealment for the employees. He used his knowledge of the building's layout to move unseen between aisles, monitoring the criminals' positions and activities. Most importantly, Frank began implementing psychological tactics designed to make the robbers believe that the store was more secure than they had anticipated. He activated emergency lighting systems, triggered additional alarms, and used the intercom to broadcast messages that suggested law enforcement was already responding to the situation. "Attention! This is store security," Frank announced over the PA system, disguising his voice to sound like multiple people. "The building is now in lockdown mode. Police units are responding and have surrounded the premises. Exit immediately through the rear entrance to avoid confrontation." Frank's strategy was based on his understanding of criminal psychology. Most robbers wanted to complete their operation quickly and escape before police arrived. If they believed that their window of opportunity had closed, they would likely flee rather than engage in a confrontation that could result in serious charges. The psychological pressure worked exactly as Frank had hoped. The three intruders became increasingly agitated as lights failed. Alarms sounded, and announcements suggested that their operation had been compromised. Instead of proceeding with their planned robbery, they began looking for ways to exit the building without being apprehended. But Frank's most crucial intervention was yet to come. As the robbers moved toward the rear exit, they encountered Jessica Morrison, Dale's daughter, who worked part-time on the overnight crew to help pay for college. Jessica had been in the stockroom when the initial alert was broadcast, and she hadn't heard Frank's instructions to gather in the break room. Frank watched through security monitors as the three armed men discovered Jessica and realized that they now had a potential hostage who could complicate their escape. The situation was escalating from robbery to kidnapping, and Frank knew that the next few minutes would determine whether Jessica survived the encounter. 25 years of police experience had taught Frank that hostage situations were unpredictable and often ended in tragedy, unless someone with the right training could control the dynamic. The criminals were now desperate, armed, and cornered, a combination that frequently resulted in violence against innocent victims. Frank had to make another decision: remain hidden and hope that police arrived before Jessica was harmed, or reveal himself and use his training to protect a young woman who was in mortal danger because she'd been in the wrong place at the wrong place. Time. Frank chose to protect Jessica. "Gentlemen," Frank called out as he emerged from the shadows of aisle 12, his hands visible but his posture conveying the confidence of someone who was accustomed to dangerous situations. "I'm Frank Patterson, and I think we need to talk." The three robbers spun toward Frank's voice, guns drawn, but something in his calm demeanor made them hesitate rather than immediately opening fire. Frank had deliberately positioned himself so that shooting him would require the criminals to turn away from Jessica, giving her an opportunity to escape. "Who the hell are you?" demanded the apparent leader of the group, a man in his 30s with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was high on stimulants. "I'm the night shift supervisor," Frank lied smoothly. And I'm the person who's been making your evening more difficult than you planned. The good news is that it doesn't have to get worse. Frank was using a technique he perfected during his police career, establishing himself as the primary point of contact with criminals, while positioning himself as someone who could solve their problems, rather than create additional complications. Look, I can see that this operation isn't going the way you expected, Frank continued, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made people want to listen. The building is secure, police are responding, and you're looking at serious charges if anyone gets hurt. But if you leave now through that back door, you can probably get to your vehicle and be gone before the first patrol unit arrives. The robbers exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Frank could see them calculating the time they'd already spent in the store, the complications that had arisen, and the risks associated with continuing the operation versus cutting their losses and fleeing. "What data?" asked one of the robbers, gesturing toward Jessica with his weapon. "She's nobody," Frank replied, deliberately minimizing Jessica's importance to reduce the likelihood that she would be taken as a hostage. "Part-time college kid who stocks shelves. She doesn't even know the safe combination or where we keep the cash deposits. Taking her with you would just slow you down and add kidnapping charges to whatever you're already facing." Frank was conducting what police called de-escalation through redirection, giving the criminals a face-saving exit strategy, while making it clear that their best option was to leave without harming anyone. The psychological pressure Frank had created throughout the evening was working. The robbers were realizing that their carefully planned operation had become a chaotic situation that was likely to result in serious consequences, regardless of how much money they obtained. The smart move was to retreat and find an easier target. "This is bullshit," muttered the leader, but Frank could hear the defeat in his voice. "Let's get out of here." The three men began moving toward the rear exit. But Frank wasn't ready to relax. He knew that desperate criminals sometimes made impulsive decisions, and he needed to maintain control of the situation until they were completely gone from the premises. "Smart choice," Frank called after them. "The cameras have been malfunctioning tonight, so there won't be clear footage of your faces. If you leave now and don't come back, this can just be an attempted break-in that didn't result in any actual losses." Frank was lying about the camera malfunctions, but he wanted to give the criminals additional incentive to leave quietly rather than trying to eliminate witnesses or cause damage that would escalate their legal exposure. The strategy worked. The three robbers exited through the rear door and were gone within 30 seconds, leaving behind a store full of shaken employees but no injuries, no hostages, and no successful theft. Frank immediately called 911 to update police dispatch on the situation and provide descriptions of the fleeing suspects. He also began the process of securing the crime scene and accounting for all employees to ensure that no one had been harmed during the incident. Police arrived 4 minutes later to find Frank coordinating with his coworkers and Jessica being comforted by other employees. The responding officers were initially skeptical about Frank's account of the incident, but their attitude changed when he provided his retired police credentials and demonstrated his professional knowledge of crime scene procedures. "Detective Patterson," said Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, who had worked with Frank during his active duty years. "What the hell are you doing working at a grocery store?" Frank smiled tiredly. "Trying to make ends meet, just like everyone else. I didn't expect to need my old skills, but I'm glad I still remembered how to use them." The investigation that followed revealed the extent to which Frank's security awareness had protected Murphy's Market from what could have been a devastating crime. The robbers were identified as members of an organized crew that had targeted 12 other businesses in the region, stealing over $150,000 and seriously injuring 3 employees who had attempted to resist. "Mr. Patterson," Detective Lisa Chang told Frank during her follow-up interview, "your recognition of the surveillance pattern and your response to the break-in probably prevented serious injuries and significant financial losses. These guys had a history of violence, and they came prepared to hurt people if necessary." The revelation of Frank's background and his role in preventing the robbery transformed his relationship with management and coworkers at Murphy's Market. The inefficient habits that had drawn criticism was suddenly recognized as professional security measures implemented by someone uniquely qualified to protect the business and its employees. "Frank, I owe you an apology," Dale Morrison told him the next day. "I should have listened when you tried to tell me about security concerns. Your experience could have saved us from a catastrophe." Frank's response was characteristically modest. I didn't take this job to be the store's security guard. I just needed work that would help pay the bills. But I couldn't ignore my training when I saw that people I cared about were in danger. The incident led to significant changes at Murphy's Market and throughout the chain of stores owned by the parent company. Frank was asked to conduct security assessments for all locations, implementing protocols that balanced customer service with crime prevention. His recommendations were adopted not only by Murphy's Market, but by other retail chains that wanted to benefit from his expertise. More importantly, Frank found that his role at the store had evolved from night shift stalker to unofficial security consultant. Management no longer criticized his habit of monitoring cameras and engaging customers in conversation. They recognized these activities as valuable security measures that protected the business and its employees. The younger members of the overnight crew now looked at Frank with respect rather than puzzlement. They understood that his slow stalking pace was actually careful observation, and his excessive caution was actually professional vigilance that kept them safe during vulnerable overnight hours. I always wondered why you seem to know so much about security stuff, said Tommy Rodriguez, a college student who worked nights to pay for school. Now I get it. You were protecting us the whole time, weren't you? Frank had nodded. That's what cops do, Tommy. We protect people. The badge doesn't change that. It just changes the uniform we wear while we're doing it. Frank continued working at Murphy's Market, but now his contributions extended beyond stocking shelves. He had become the store's resident expert on security, a resource for other businesses in the community, and a bridge between retail workers and law enforcement in matters related to crime prevention. Customers who had once been puzzled by Frank's lengthy conversations now understood that he was maintaining the kind of community awareness that helped keep neighborhoods safe. His presence in the store became a source of comfort for late-night shoppers who appreciated knowing that someone with law enforcement experience was watching over their safety. Most importantly, Frank had found a way to continue serving his community even after his official retirement from police work. The skills and instincts that had made him an effective detective were now being used to protect a different kind of community in a different kind of environment. Because Frank Patterson had learned something during his transition from law enforcement to retail work. Being a protector wasn't about the title you held or the uniform you wore. It was about staying alert to danger, caring enough about other people to put their safety before your own convenience, and having the courage to act when action was necessary to prevent harm. Some guardians wear police uniforms and carry service weapons. Others wear store aprons and push freight carts, but the mission remains the same. Watch for danger, protect the innocent, and never let your guard down even when everyone around you thinks you're being paranoid. Frank Patterson had spent 25 years protecting his community as a police detective. Now he spent his nights protecting it as a grocery store employee. It was the same calling, just practiced in a different environment. A retail store instead of patrol car, prevention instead of investigation, protection instead of prosecution. And for the employees and customers of Murphy's Market, that protection made all the difference between safety and tragedy. So now I ask you, how many Frank Pattersons work quietly among us in retail stores, restaurants, and businesses across the country? How many retired law enforcement officers have found ways to continue protecting their communities in civilian jobs? Share your thoughts in the comments, because heroes don't always announce their credentials. Sometimes they just quietly position themselves between danger and innocence, asking no recognition except the knowledge that people go home safely at the end of their shift. Thank you for watching Retired Soldier Stories. If this tale of quiet vigilance and protective instincts moved you, subscribe and help us honor those who never stop serving, even when their badge becomes a name tag. Until next time, remember that the person stocking shelves next to you might be the most qualified guardian in the building, and sometimes, the most important arrest a detective never makes is the one prevented by someone who knew how to recognize danger and had the courage to stand between criminals and innocent people.